So the context for this talk is around evaluating projects or evaluating policies or evaluating initiatives, and just because it's convenient and it rolls off the tongue easily, I'll probably just call them all projects, but it's broader than just a sort of a narrow, discrete project. But what I mean is a set of initiatives, a set of activities, a set of actions that you undertake to achieve a particular goal or a target. So that obviously covers a huge range of possibilities. And so as we go through the talk, I'm going to talk about a number of specific approaches to evaluating value for money, but I'm also going to give some tips and tricks and warnings of things not to do. So the first tip is that if you think that you want to evaluate value for money, you can't really do that without defining the project or the policy that is going to generate the benefits that you're trying to evaluate. You can't just, so for example, I work in environmental areas quite a bit, and some people in the Department of Environment in Canberra were asking my advice on how should they prioritise their investment in threatened species. So the problem with that is that there's not just one thing you could do for any particular species. There's all sorts of projects that you could generate for any one species. So to say, what's the value for money from investing in a particular species doesn't get you very far. You can't say anything about the costs or the risks or anything until you get to something that's more specific. What are you actually going to do for that species? Okay, so that's the first tip. So the second thing is that in this context of doing evaluations, there are sort of two time frames that we could be thinking about. There is what economists call ex ante or forward-looking evaluations, and ex post or backward-looking evaluations. So I'm not sure what would be of greatest interest to you. I do both. I'll probably do more on the ex ante, but I also do get involved in the ex post. So ex ante is so looking forwards, trying to evaluate possible investments in the future, is really about supporting decision making. So doing things like trying to rank the options, rank the projects that you could invest in, judging whether any particular project is worth funding or not, and comparing alternative designs for a specific project. So that's trying to make decisions about something that hasn't happened yet. Whereas ex post is more often used for accountability purposes, trying to test whether an investment was actually worthwhile after the fact, or learning from experience so that you can do a better job next time. So they're both relevant, they're both important, and the techniques are basically the same. It's just how easy it is to get the information really that differs between the two. Okay, so why do we care? Why does anyone ever say, I'd like to know about the value for money that we'll get from this particular project or policy? Well, it's pretty obvious. I think it's because it helps to maximise the benefits to society from that project or program. That's why you'd care. And sometimes I hear people make comments along the lines of, well, that's just economist stuff and you're just worried about the money, and so I don't really care about value for money. But to me, that's not what it's about. It's not really about the money, it's about the value, right? Because you're probably going to spend the money anyway. It's not like you're going to save money on anything, you're going to spend the money on something. And the idea of worrying about value for money is to get the greatest value for that given amount of money that you can, right? So it's not sort of, boring accounting or economist stuff. It's actually about generating benefits for society. So in the right conditions, if you choose projects with the highest value for money, then you can maximise the overall benefits from a pool of investment funds. So, and the point I'm making is that this is not in conflict with social or environmental goals. In fact, it's a way of achieving your social and environmental goals if you do it well. All right, so I wanted to just sort of locate this thinking about value for money in a broader evaluation process. I know that you guys are interested in evaluation, and so this is probably old hat, but I think it's helpful just to sort of say, well, within the whole process, at what point does this pop up? So this is one version of an evaluation process, and you might have your own, but this is the sort of process that I generally try and follow. Understand the issues and the context. You might spend quite a lot of time doing that before you get into actually collecting numbers and so on. Define a project or the projects that you're going to evaluate and a baseline that you're going to compare them to. Identify the types of benefits and costs, just the types of them initially, that are going to be generated by that project. Try and identify who would gain, who would lose, who would pay as a result of the project. Then get into some numbers, collect information to to try and identify the benefits, quantify the benefits and costs if you can. Do something with those numbers to sort of express them in a way that tells you something about value for money. So put them in some sort of metric or process calculation. Worry about the uncertainty in all that process. There's always uncertainty about what will happen or about what did happen, and report your results. So the bits that I'll be talking about mainly today are that, right? So my focus today is on trying to worry about what information to collect and what to do with that information, how to process it to say something sensible about value for money. But I think it's relevant that it occurs in this broader process. And I would also observe that the other bits outside that box, it should be common to pretty much any good evaluation process, right? So I'm going to talk about a whole range of options, but if you did any of them well, you'd do all those other things outside the box, more or less the same, right? It's the bit inside the box that's going to vary from method to method, largely. All right, so I'm going to talk about a variety of different possible approaches, starting with some quantitative approaches. I'll cover a couple of different ways, approaches that are both called cost effectiveness analysis, but they're a little bit different. I'll talk about cost utility analysis, and I'll talk about benefit costs or cost benefit analysis. I'll talk about some others that are sort of quantitative but a bit more subjective, so multi-criteria analysis and a rough BCA, which I'll explain what that is when we get to it. And then I'll cover a couple of relatively qualitative approaches that can still be useful. A thing called the basic efficiency resource analysis and a value for money rubric. As Theo said, this is not comprehensive. There are other techniques that people use, but this probably covers most of the evaluations that most people would cover, most people would do. And the questions that I'm going to try and answer about each of these methods is, what are they? You know, how do they work at a pretty high level? There's a lot of methods there. I can't go into great depth about any of them, so it's a sort of a skating across a lot of options. But I'm trying to give you a sense of what they are, how they work, what their strengths are, when are they appropriate to use, some tips about them, as I said, and also some warnings about traps and mistakes that can be made when you're doing some of these. So last slide before I actually start talking about the individual methods is, what do I mean by value for money? So what I mean by it, and this isn't always used the same way as I think Theo hinted, what I mean by it is some measure of some sort about the benefits from the project divided by some measure of the costs of the project. And the variation between these methods is largely in how you measure the benefits and how you measure the costs. So it's expressing it in some way as benefit per unit cost. Some approaches don't actually quite do that. They do something with the benefits and costs, but they don't express it in that sort of benefits over cost way. And that can still be useful. I'm not saying it's a useless thing to do, but at least to my interpretation, that's not value for money, it's something else. Okay, so let's get into this array of different approaches. The first one is a thing called cost effectiveness analysis, and I've got two versions of that to tell you about. The first one is where you have a set of projects, and either by design or by coincidence, they would all deliver the same outcomes. Right? So I recently did a study in Victoria looking at flood mitigation near the Yarra River, and we were asked to evaluate two projects. One was a concrete engineering-based approach, and the other was a concrete and vegetation hybrid approach, and they were both designed in such a way that they would deliver the same level of flood mitigation, right? And so that was really great for me because I didn't have to worry about quantifying the benefits. The benefits would be the same. It just comes down to then quantifying the costs. And so all I'm doing in that case is assessing the cost effectiveness of those two options. The one with the best cost effectiveness is the one that you'd recommend. So the advantage, as I've said, is that you don't have to get into great detail about how you measure the benefits, except you need to be able to measure them well enough to know that they are the same, right? You have to have a way of measuring the benefits so that you know that they're the same. So if you're just hoping that this will happen, then it's probably limited applicability. Like in that case, it was actually designed to be the same. If that's not the case, then this approach probably has, in my experience, relatively limited applicability, because you don't often find a set of projects that do deliver the same projects. They're different scales, they deliver different types of benefits and so on. So that's the first one. The second one, which confusingly is also called cost effectiveness analysis, looks pretty much the same, but it's a non-monetary measure of overall benefit divided by a measure of the costs. The difference this time is that the level of benefits doesn't have to be the same between the project, just the type. So I did one of these looking at threatened species. So, and the measure of benefit was the probability of the species survival. So it's the same for all of them. And we assumed that the species were all equally valuable. That's a bit of a heroic assumption, in fact, but that's what we were asked to do. And so it comes down to the different benefits are different for different species, depending on how effective the projects would be at delivering survival for those species. We didn't have to worry about trying to value the species or anything like that, which is things get more difficult. We had a way of measuring benefits, which was just a sort of a biological way, and we would divide that increase in probability of survival by the cost of the different projects to get a measure of cost effectiveness. Okay, so it's a single measure of benefit, and all benefits deliver the same type of benefit. All of the projects deliver the same type of benefit, and if you use this, you sort of have to ignore the other types of benefits, right? You can't really accommodate them. It may be that the project also delivers some other benefit. Well, if you care about that other type of benefit, this is not the technique, right? You can only use this one effectively if you're happy to focus in on one particular type of benefit. Or unless you've got some way of combining the benefits together to express them as one number. So cost utility analysis, so Theo sent me a bunch of documents that presented a range of options for this, and one of them that came up a couple of times was cost utility analysis. Not one I've ever used, so I went to explore what is this. Turns out it's basically another name for cost effectiveness analysis, but it's the name that's commonly used in the health economics literature. And it's often associated with a particular type of benefit called a QALY. A QALY is a sort of a way of summarising the benefits of a health initiative. It's a generic measure of disease burden, including both the quality and quantity of life lived. And it basically, one QALY equates to 1 year of perfect health. So they've solved the problem of how do we measure these benefits. We've got one measure. You can imagine that all sorts of different types of disease or morbidity issues might be measurable with this sort of common metric, and then they can use this in what I would call a cost effectiveness analysis. But okay, now I've made it to cost benefit analysis or benefit cost analysis, same thing. And the difference here is that we're expressing everything in monetary terms. And what that gives us is advantages that we didn't have at least in the cost effectiveness one, where we can now combine different benefit types into one metric relatively easily in the benefit part of the equation. And we can also compare projects that generate different types of benefits. It's quite a significant advantage. The downside is you need to be able to express your benefits in monetary terms, which is not always an easy thing to do. So economists have developed an array of techniques, which I'm not going to talk about today, for doing that. They're getting better and better at it. There's now about half a dozen different approaches that can be used, some based on surveys, some based on people's behaviour, some based on observing behaviour in a market which relates to the sort of intangible benefit that you're trying to quantify. And these days they're reasonably effective and they've been pretty well tested. So these are sort of techniques to monetize the intangibles. So they're sort of expressing these intangible benefits in monetary equivalent terms, I would say. So Theo earlier mentioned this thing called social return on investment analysis. Economists don't use that term. We just say benefit cost analysis. A social return on investment analysis, according to some documents, is a benefit cost analysis where you've included these monetised versions of the intangible environmental, social benefits. I just call that benefit cost analysis. That's just a benefit cost analysis done well, including all the relevant information. Okay, next one is multi-criteria analysis. Also like benefit cost analysis, very widely used tool. Also has the advantage that it allows us to combine different benefit types or different indicators of benefits. This is a sort of a more heterogeneous set of approaches than benefit cost analysis. There's a sort of a variety of styles to multi-criterion analysis that different people use. And having looked at quite a few of them, I think they range in quality from really quite good to really quite terrible. And so I'll make some comments about that. The really quite good end of that spectrum is when they're sort of more like a benefit cost analysis. They don't necessarily have to go to the monetisation step, but they're sort of structured and a bit rigorous, a bit like a benefit cost analysis. In that, they estimate their benefits by comparing a project to a baseline. That's really important. I'll come back to that, as I've said. Not all MCAs do that, unfortunately. They focus on outcomes rather than sort of indicators of sort of intermediate steps. And they weight those improvements in outcomes by some sort of weighting that expresses their importance. So we've still got this sort of general structure of some measure of benefits divided by some measure of costs. And in the case of multi-criteria analysis, the most common way this is done in the top line is this quite specific way of a weight times an outcome plus a weight times a different outcome plus and so on, a different weight for each outcome. Add them up, you get a number. Hard to interpret what that number is, but you can tell that a bigger number is better than a smaller number. That's the general idea. And then you divide that by your costs and get your value for money indicator from that. So if done well, I'm quite happy to use multi-criteria analysis. The key way that it differs from benefit cost analysis is where do those weights come from? A common way of doing an MCA is like a workshop environment or a group of experts, sometimes with a group of community people in a room thrashing it out, trying to reach agreement about how important are these different possible outcomes and expressing them on some sort of scale. It could be like a 1 to 10, 1 to 100 sort of scale that expresses their importance, their impact, their relevance to the community, and those are the weights that feed into that equation. Benefit cost analysis sort of does the same thing, except that the weights, we would prefer the weights come from sort of evidence-based sources if we can get them. Actually, we will revert to the workshop approach if we have to. Like that, sometimes that's the best available approach. But if we can, we'll go to evidence about benefits that we can measure in a quantitative way with a survey or with observing transactions in a market or something. But they're very similar. They can be very similar. But they're not always. So at the not very good at all end of the spectrum, just wanted to flag what aspects of an MCA do I not like. One is, as I've said, that when they don't compare the project to some sort of baseline, sometimes they're not very focused on the outcomes. I've seen quite a lot of multi-criteria analysis where they use a set of indicators of things that they think would be related to the delivery of outcomes, but they're not the outcomes. And they do the same sort of trick. They say things like this: okay, what's the feasibility of this project? What's the risk associated with delivering the benefits of this project? How likely are people to change their behaviour? Over what scale would the project be implemented? And then we'll somehow come up with some weights for each of those, and we'll add them up. That will be our measure of benefits, and we'll divide those by the costs. Unfortunately, that doesn't work very well. One of the things that I published a couple of years ago was an assessment of different ways of evaluating the information to do this. This came out surprisingly poor. And one of the problems is that if you were evaluating value for money well, most of these things would not be just added up. So to give you an example, if a project is more risky or less risky, then you've probably got some multiplicative measure of risk that you want to scale up or scale down the benefits by, right? So in fact, the way it turns out is most of these end up being a better measure of value for money if they're multiplicative. It's not always the case, but it's often the case. And so the default approach that many people use in MCA of just adding everything up means that it's just sort of mathematically wrong. It doesn't actually measure the benefits very well. Even worse, sometimes people don't divide by the costs. They take the costs, they multiply them by another weight, and they subtract them. And that turns out to be terrible. That's, in fact, in the assessments that I did, that turns out to be really not much better than random numbers, just pulling which projects you prefer out of a hat. Next one I want to touch on is a thing called a rough BCA. So I was developing a benefit cost analysis tool for the water sector last year, and I was reading the different guidelines that different governments have around the world for how to do a benefit cost analysis, so I would be compliant. And I was really interested to see an idea in the New Zealand guidelines that said it's very useful before you do a full benefit cost analysis to do a rough one. They didn't really give much guidance, but I thought it was a really interesting idea. So I thought, well, I'll create one. I'll create a system for doing a rough benefit cost analysis. So this is something that I use in a training environment or in a workshop environment as pretty much a precursor to doing it properly, right? It's actually just a way of getting people thinking about the problem in an appropriate way, and also helping them assess whether they think that the project is even worth assessing, and whether they're likely to have the information needed to assess it, right? So have that sort of conversation before you make a commitment to go for a full-blown assessment. Turns out to be quite a useful thing to do. So there's all sorts of ways you could do this. I've just developed one particular approach where we start by defining the with and without project scenarios. We score, we have an extensive conversation about what the project is and what it will deliver. Then we come up with some sort of simple score, 1 to 5, of the benefits and costs and the project risks. I've got a little metric, which is more or less the same as what you've seen already, to come up with a number, and you can rank the projects. I wouldn't want to rely on it as my actual way of evaluating final projects, but as a step along the way, it's turned out to be quite a useful and interesting approach. Okay, one of the things I'd never heard of that was in one of the documents that Theo sent me was a thing called a basic efficiency resource analysis. This is even simpler again. Personally, I think it's too simple. I think it's gone beyond the threshold of where it gets so simple that, is it really worth doing? So what they do here is they, I think again in a workshop type environment, they do pretty much a bit like my rough BCA. Along the bottom axis there you've got outputs, and you're trying to assess whether the outputs from this project are high or low. Whew, that's pretty crude. And whether the inputs are high or low, very crude. And then categorise all the projects that you're looking at into above average, below average, about average efficiency. So yeah, okay, they're having a conversation about value for money. So simple though that it really is a very blunt instrument. Something else that was also simple, but I thought more useful than that version, is a thing called the value for money rubric. So this is used a bit in the international development space in developing countries, particularly for social programs in those countries. And so the idea here is that you start with a theory of change for the project, and in fact you probably should have that for any of these approaches. If to be honest, you've got to understand how your project is going to deliver change. But they sort of emphasise it as part of this process. And then, again, we're in this sort of workshop environment, work with a group of well-informed stakeholders to develop a rubric. So the rubric sets out a set of criteria and standards for assessing performance. I'll show you an example shortly. They're often quite qualitative, although they can have quantitative elements within them. Here's an example. It's just 4 levels. On the left, how do I tell whether this project is excellent, good, just average, or unacceptable? And there's a whole series of sort of different questions that are asked, and you're going to score it on that range for each of them. I've only shown one question here. The question is, how effective were community partners in encouraging children and families from target groups to participate in some program? And they've got together and they've agreed that they're going to score the project as excellent if the activity is accessed by a wide range of people from different groups in community, especially hard to engage groups. Just adequate is activity is accessed by people from some groups. Unacceptable is not many groups. Okay, so they've sort of worked out what they judge to be good, bad, or indifferent, express it through a range of, in this case, just qualitative terms, but it can be quantitative. And so the use of this approach is largely for ex post analysis. It's not that useful, I don't think, for ex ante, for making decisions about projects that you haven't done yet, but it's a way of doing a very simple, but I think somewhat meaningful evaluation of an existing project or policy. So it also could be a useful first step prior to a more rigorous evaluation, a bit like the rough BCA. I would observe though that at least the examples that I've seen don't actually measure value for money, they just measure some sort of measure of performance or outcomes or effectiveness. That's okay. All right, I'm running a bit short of time here. I want to cover a couple of issues relatively quickly. I'll try and zoom through them. A couple of times I've emphasised this importance of having a baseline and comparing a project against some sort of benchmark. So you could call that a without project scenario, or a baseline, or a benchmark, or a counterfactual scenario. All means the same thing. It's what are you going to compare your project with? This is really hammered to economists when you're learning how to do a benefit cost analysis. They hit you with this like a sledgehammer. It's not sufficiently emphasised in some of the other evaluation techniques, and so it's not always done as well as it should be. And so I want to show you why it matters so much. Here is a graph that shows you over time, along the horizontal axis, what might happen to some measure of the benefits, which is the vertical axis, if you did a project, the yellow line, compared to if you didn't do the project, the purple line. So you can see that in this case, we've got some by year 10, we've got some vertical distance between those lines, things have improved thanks to the project, and so that's our measure of benefit. The vertical distance there becomes our number that we'll use as the benefit, or it'll feed into some evaluation process, but that's an indication of the benefit. In that case, that's pretty straightforward, but it's not always that straightforward, because sometimes the world would get worse if you did nothing. Okay, so in this case, if you did a before versus after comparison, you are not doing justice to the project. Right? In the previous one, you could do before versus after and you'd be okay. In this one, if you do before versus after, you miss out half the benefits, right? Because you've actually got, the world would have got worse without the project. Sometimes the world would have got better without the project. And if you don't take account of that, you can overestimate the benefits of the project, right? You observe the yellow line, you think things are really great, but somehow, you need to ask yourself, well, what would have happened if we didn't do the project? So I was asked to evaluate a project on salinity in Victoria, and it turned out there was a case like this. They'd actually had some pretty good results. The salinity had fallen, water tables had fallen, and they were attributing it, they wanted to attribute it to some project work. Actually, it was because it had been relatively dry, right? So sometimes, here's another example where if the baseline is falling over time, the without project scenario is getting worse. With the project is also getting worse, but it's not getting worse as quickly, right? So there is actually a benefit of the project. You're worse than you were before the project, but that's sort of irrelevant. You're better off than you would have been without the project. That's what's relevant, right? This sort of with versus without comparison is so important. It's not with before versus after, it's with versus without. Of course, that makes life really difficult, because if you've done the project, you can't see the without project scenario, right? It doesn't exist. And also, if you haven't done the project, you're doing it, anticipating, it means you've got to predict two scenarios, the with and the without. It's hard enough to predict one of them, but if you're going to do it well, you've got to predict them both. That's just life, right? That's how it is. Now, this seems like common sense when you lay out that you look at those four graphs and you say, oh, four, of course, that's what you'd do. But it's amazing how often this does not happen. And just as one example of that, some ecologists were looking at 16 conservation planning tools that were basically doing cost effectiveness analysis of different ways of prioritising conservation projects. And they found that of the 16, only one did with versus without comparisons. All the rest were doing before versus after comparisons, or they were just doing with comparisons and comparing it to nothing, right? There was no comparison. It was just with. So, again, it's a way of generating random numbers, right? It's really not a measure of benefits without doing the with versus without. Okay, I've hammered that enough. Let me jump to another one. Here's one that I saw. This was one that almost made me want to cry, which was I was asked to help with a process where they had already got a metric, and the metric was one like in the middle there. So it's one of these multi-criteria ones. A weight times some variable plus a weight times another variable plus a weight times another variable, and one of the variables was value for money. What do you think of that? It's insane, right? It's completely mad, because value for money is not one of the factors. Value for money is the whole thing, right? But you use those other variables to calculate the benefits and to calculate the costs to give you value for money, right? Value for money is the whole overall criterion that you should be using, not one of the factors in this long equation of variables. Yeah. So don't do that. All right. So this is, to sum it all up, what's the punchline out of all of those different approaches? When would you use one or the other of those? So I'll quickly zoom through that. Cost effectiveness analysis version 1, that's either ex ante or ex post, and it's when all the projects have exactly the same benefits. Cost effectiveness version 2, still ex ante or ex post, when all the projects give the same type of benefit, but could be different levels. Benefit cost analysis could be ex ante or ex post, when you need to compare projects that generate different types of benefits, or you need to combine different types of benefits within one project. And because this is the hardest of them to do, probably, if you're serious and you have the time and the expertise and the resources to do it. Rough BCA, probably ex ante only, and as a first look at a project before you do one of the others. Multi-criteria, I've got a bit bolshy here. I've said never, unless you do it well, right? Unless you know how to do it well and you do it well, because doing it badly is not worth doing. And then basic efficiency resource analysis, ex ante only probably, and only if you only have almost no time. I think it's probably too simplistic, probably slightly better than not doing anything, but only if you've got, very little time to do something. And then the value for money rubric is ex post only. A simple approach is needed, and a qualitative approach is sufficient.
Thanks, Dave. That's great. Well, I think David probably made